My name is James Tiberius Kirk.
If you don't tell me your name, I'm gonna have to make one up.
It's Ahura.
Ahura? No way. That's the name I was gonna make up for you.
Jim Kirk. Coy. Leonard McCoy.
Who was that pointy-eared bastard?
I don't know.
I am Spock. Bullshit.
2 Klingon vessels have entered the neutral zone and are locking weapons on us.
That's okay?
That's okay?
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Captain, we're detecting a massive power signature within orbit. It seems another vessel is targeting Harlak.
Captain Michael Burnham, you've been away too long. Don't you bow before your emperor?
I did choose you, but not for the reasons you think.
He told you that destiny brought you together.
Different universe, yet somehow the same people had a way to find each other.
None of this was an accident. My so-called captain's not from my universe. He's from yours.
Welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi, with me, James.
And me, Matt. Every series on this podcast, we explore the world of science fiction cinema by taking a trip through a different subgenre of sci-fi.
This series, our journey is through the fantastical world of space opera.
Welcome back, listeners. We are approaching the end of our space opera series, and as we always do towards the end of our series, we are talking about Star Trek and how our sci-fi subgenre is reflected in Star Trek. And last week, I sort of said at the end of our Star Wars episode that we were going back to the real big daddy of space opera, and I don't know if it is the big daddy of space opera, and I think we can talk about that today. But yeah, we're coming back and seeing how space opera manifests itself and is reflected in the Star Trek franchise. What have we kind of chosen to look at that topic this week, James?
So, off the back of our previous episode where we were exploring the Star Wars trilogy and Disney's era, and of course the director JJ Abrams, we are appropriately looking at Star Trek, the film from 2009, directed by said director JJ Abrams. And we're also going to be talking about Star Trek Discovery. So both of these are kind of like soft reboots, reinventions of Star Trek in a lot of ways. So I think they feed into space opera a lot more than some of the other series and expanded universe of Star Trek itself. So yeah, there's also a specific story arc which we're looking at in Star Trek Discovery as well, right, Matt?
Yeah, we're looking at 4 episodes in particular from the first season of Star Trek Discovery, episodes 10 through 13. So episode 10, Despite Yourself, episode 11, The Wolf Inside, 12, Vaulting Ambition, 13, What's Past is Prologue. And the big Discovery fans, if they are out there, will recognise those 4 episodes as being the Mirror Universe arc in season 1 of Discovery, when our characters get stuck in the mirror universe that characters have been visiting throughout the franchise, and they're stuck there for 4 episodes, which is a real space opera jaunt. But interesting that we're talking about these 2 kind of reboots and continuations of a long-running space opera franchise, which seems to be a behind-the-scenes theme of space opera.
Yeah, so both of these things which we're looking at today, they kind of subvert Star Trek in a lot of ways. But what do you think of Star Trek when it comes to space opera then? Because you've already hinted at the start that you don't think it necessarily falls into that category. What's your thinking behind that then? Because as always, Matt, you are my guide through the Star Trek universe. You're always here to help me out through the expanded universe of Star Trek. It's so vast. There's so many series. But why do you think it doesn't really fall into that category per se?
Well, I think Star Trek is space opera, right? Like that's something that I just feel in my bones, you know, like it just feels and sounds right. Star Trek is definitely space opera. Star Trek is obviously space opera. But having watched so many space opera movies and discussed it at length throughout this series, I look back now at Star Trek and I just don't see those tropes in Star Trek at all, really. You know, first and foremost, Star Trek is so serious and primarily cerebral storytelling, especially in the earliest days, where the earliest days, you know, the original series and into Next Generation, you've got some of the foremost sci-fi writers just telling one-off stories about a very science fictional, philosophical idea that they spin out in a sci-fi context. And it can be quite slow paced. You might have a bit of Kirk or Worf throwing hands to keep it spicy, and threats of torpedoes, etc. But for the most part, it's about seeking out new life and new civilizations, isn't it? That's not space opera. That's a sort of diplomatic mission, right? That's literally what it's all about. It's a utopian society where the heroes are on a diplomatic mission. They have military capabilities and force, but their primary existence is much more diplomatic. So it just doesn't quite fit space opera, does it?
And when we're talking about space opera, it's that kind of that spectacle, that over the top nature of it. There's a big evil empire every time. There's some kind of like war going on, and you're following like a savior, and it's usually one person who is your big protagonist in that said universe that you're following. And it feels like Star Trek's more of a group outing, isn't it? There's lots of eclectic characters, but it's all very much we're all in it together, we're gonna get this done. And that utopian sort of philosophy behind it, I think, makes it a little bit difficult to pigeonhole into space opera.
Yeah, and the longer it went on as well, you do have antagonistic, imperious forces. You've got the Klingon Empire, you've got the Romulan Empire. They're out there, but the longer it goes on, those things are written in a way that's, you know, very realistic over the course of over 100 years of sort of plot. So the Klingon Empire is no longer a threat by the time we get to Next Generation. Certainly, you've got some absolutely psychotic Klingons, but you've also got Klingons that are recurring friendly characters. There is no one kind of... It's just not as two-dimensional as a space opera empire. Maybe the Romulans are a little bit more, but even then, in Next Generation, there's this sort of diplomatic uneasiness with the Romulan Empire. They're pretty bad guys. They're all kind of bastards, but they also don't do anything. We're not at war with them. We've got the neutral zone. We leave them alone. They leave us alone. We kind of keep track of things in that regard. So we do have empires, but it's all got to be kind of stable and realistic. And then we get these occasional moments, though, where they go into the mirror universe. And this is just an opportunity to really do whatever you want with it. I mean, first and foremost, it's so that the characters can have a beard and like be an evil version of themselves and have a bit of fun. But again, as time goes on, you're writing it for years and years, and you keep going back into it, and a narrative develops, and we start to get a bit more of a two-dimensional evil empire space opera backdrop that the characters can just parachute into once a season and fight some bad guys and be a swashbuckling hero, like Luke Skywalker, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, all of these characters.
And it's that kind of lack of the fantasy element as well, which we've seen so much in space opera. I mean, we've seen our fair share of more realistic space operas as well, but a lot of them have this kind of fantastical element in them, whether it be the Force or the glaive in Kroll, all of these things which have that tinge of fantasy to them. And also it's this idea of where space operas come from, because space opera initially was meant to be a subgenre that was made up of cliches and formulaic material, because it was just being made in that same way, and it was sort of paint by numbers. This is what we do in a space opera. And that, of course, came from horse operas. And horse operas were this idea of westerns, which were very formulaic, like whether that be film or television. And that's another interesting factor of Star Trek, because Star Trek was initially sold by Gene Roddenberry as, to quote him, he said it would be like a wagon train in space. And Wagon Train was this American Western series, which was out in the 50s. Loads of episodes. We were looking at all the different episodes, weren't we, before today's episode?
Yeah, it ran for nearly 300 seasons, which obviously Star Trek didn't get, but then, you know, Roddenberry gets the last laugh after it's revived in the 80s, and it's got way more than 300 episodes.
I was a freelance writer who got tired of writing scripts about nothing at all, and I began reading science fiction. And so I dreamed up the Star Trek idea so that I could comment on man and society. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They thought that I made it too complicated. They felt I had offered them a wagon train to the stars, which I had, because I wanted to sell it. And Westerns were very big at the time. And they felt that I double-crossed them. I'd written them this thing about where the mind went in certain ways, and they wanted someone with bare knuckles in a fist fight. They turned it down, but they did like some parts of it. The first time they said they'd ever felt like they were truly in a spaceship. And they turned it down. They said, now, if you will really give us the equivalent of a Western, we can put you back to work on it. So we made them a second show, which had a lot of science fiction elements too, but at least it ended up with Bill Shatner in a bare-knuckle fist fight in which he beats a godlike figure in a fair brawl. And I thought it was a terrible idea, but it worked and it met their needs, and that started us. We sold Star Trek with it.
So he got the formula right for Star Trek, to say the least. Because Star Trek's always felt a bit like a Western. Like initially, the original series felt like a Western, didn't it? Because it's them exploring the frontier. They're going to different planets. And that's a part of space opera as well. It's this voyage, different fantastical worlds, exploring them, going around in your wagon or your spacecraft or vessel, whatever, and going on these adventures. And that was the early Star Trek. But because Star Trek went on for so long and had so much of an evolution, like you say, over the course of this hundreds of years of lore and what's happened in the universe, different conflicts, you've got all of these different science fiction elements and writers coming in that are giving it a very different feel. And then because it is science fiction at its core, it goes down the science route more than some of these other space operas we've covered in the series, because people get obsessive about this. When we looked at Galaxy Quest, there were those people which loved the fictional world of Galaxy Quest and went to the extent of knowing how the spaceship was laid out and what all of the different terminology actually meant. And they could plot it all out. And there are Star Trek fans which have that kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the world.
James, I had the interactive Starship Enterprise on my PC growing up. It was like you could go on like a tour of the inside and like interact with all the computers and stuff. So yeah, you had like the maps and stuff. You could like look around and see how everything works.
I love that because, again, it's that grounding in the kind of reality of it. I think that kind of separates it a little bit from space opera.
I think so. I think Star Trek definitely has its cake and eats it as well in that regard, because I think that you do have these, you have serious sci-fi writers who take it seriously and are trying to like bring in all these concepts, and you have all these nerds who obsess over the science that they use. But at the same time, definitely in the original series, well, in all of them really, the techno-babble that they use to get around an explanation of something, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's all like grounded in real science, but it never sounds like it. It's just like Geordi, it's like, I can't think of a good example of it, but it's very much in the vein of the Doctor reversing the polarity. I think in Doctor Who, they do that for a laugh. It's always reversed the polarity because it's funny that it's always the same bit of techno-babble or regularly. But it's that kind of caliber of techno-babble. Geordi just spouts something out of Data, or Scotty. There's always just something either going extremely wrong, so we can't do that, or something's gone extremely right, so everyone's okay. And it just sort of breezes over that. So Star Trek definitely has its cake and eats it when it comes to those serious sci-fi concepts.
Yeah, and I keep sort of drawing comparisons between what we said about Dune and what we're saying about Star Trek now, because we said Dune very much felt space opera in its essence, because it's kind of got some of the it's big spectacle. It's that fantastical nature of the powers which Paul has, and that kind of gives it that more fantasy, religious aspect, even though it's all very carefully planned out, and you find out all the stuff that's happening there. But there is something, I think the thing with Star Trek is so vast that it's difficult to put it down as a space opera It's many, many things.
Yeah, but I tell you what Star Trek consistently is for sci-fi, and one of the reasons we keep coming back to it every series is it is a playground for all science fiction. So you can do a time travel story, you can do an artificial intelligence story, and you do those to death throughout the hundreds and hundreds of episodes. So it makes sense that there would be opportunities for real space opera, proper swashbuckling adventure fantasy stuff to come in at some point. It's appropriate for it to be fertile ground for any subgenre of sci-fi to exist in moments. But it definitely feels like those moments are when it's not Trek, when Star Trek is not Star Trek, is when it is able to be space opera. And I think that's what we've got some examples of that today, I think.
So shall we get into one of those examples then? Shall we talk a little bit about 2009 Star Trek film, Star Trek, directed by JJ Abrams?
Yes, let's go. Warp Factor 4.
Is that a fast one?
I don't want to get too much into it, mate. But I think Warp Factor 4 is quite fast in Kirk's era, because they go at Warp Factor 4 in this film. But they're certainly going faster than that in Picard and Janeway's era.
Okay, so let's go quite fast into the next segment.
I couldn't believe it when the bartender told me who you are.
Why are you talking to me, man?
Your father was captain of a starship for 12 minutes. He saved 800 lives, including yours. I dare you to do better. Enlist in Starfleet.
You will experience fear. Fear in the face of certain death.
Pull your chute!
We received a distress call.
I've been waiting for this day my whole life. This day of reckoning.
We've got no captain and no first officer to replace him.
Yeah, we do.
You are capable of deciding your own destiny. The question is, which path will you choose?
Back talking about JJ Abrams then, and his take on the Star Trek franchise. So you're a big Star Trek fan. You watched Next Generation, you watched Deep Space Nine, you watched Voyager, all of the ones which were around as we were growing up. And I know you're a big fan of all of that. But what did you feel when you heard that JJ Abrams was taking on Star Trek back in 2009?
I don't think I had an opinion about JJ Abrams taking on Star Trek. That's kind of a leading question there, isn't it? You're asking.
It's like, what about this guy?
But I was certainly... I was very much under the spell of Lost at this point in time. So I would have been happy about that. What I was excited about was a big blockbuster Star Trek movie coming out. I was really excited about that. This was the first Star Trek film I saw at the cinema, I think. It must have been. I'd seen all the Star Trek movies, but none of them at the cinema at this time. And there hadn't been any new Star Trek for about 4 years, I think, at this point, which is not a very long time, but it was the first 4 years of my life where there wasn't any new Star Trek coming out. It was the only gap. There'd been 18 solid years of new Star Trek stuff coming out every single year, which was my entire life up to the point when Enterprise stopped on TV in 2005. So that 4 years felt like just a void of Star Trek. It just felt like Star Trek ended, and it was like, oh, I guess Star Trek was around my whole life, and then it stopped. So that was a hugely exciting feeling. Did you go and see this at the cinema as well?
Yeah, I went to go and see it at the cinema. I think I wrote a paper on it
at
uni about the sound in it.
Okay.
I can't for the life of me remember what I was saying in it. It was something probably about sound in space and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I was very excited to see it because there was a lot of hype around it. Again, I was very much in the Lost hype still. So I was like, okay, great. This is going to be really good. And I think it was at the time I was properly in it with this film. It's action packed. It's got all this crazy backstory, and it's also doing something a bit different. And there hadn't been a big sci-fi action film for a while that had this kind of feeling to it. And I think that's what I really latched onto when I watched it for the first time.
It was 1 year after Iron Man, and it felt like kind of an incredible time to be a nerdy 20-year-old, you know? I think there's few films I have enjoyed at the cinema as much as the first time I saw this movie. It was just like such an electric feeling of seeing, you know, this massive sci-fi action blockbuster, which is one of my favorite genres, version of one of my favorite things, which is Star Trek. So it was those two things coming together in this very slick action movie that just blew me away. But I don't think that Star Trek fans older than me, older than 20 years old at the time, were as happy as I was when it came out.
Well, yeah, because obviously there's that feeling about the original series. And if that's what you've grown up with, like we talked about with Star Wars, if you've grown up with the original trilogy, the other trilogies are going to seem very different. And I think the same is applicable to this, because if you'd grown up with the original series, this is suddenly JJ Abrams coming along and saying, this is what I think Star Trek is. And also there was quite a lot of controversy around that afterwards, because he openly admitted that he wasn't a massive Star Trek fan. Like, he said he hadn't watched much of the original series. He's been quoted a few times as saying lots of stuff like that. He says the original series always felt like a silly, campy thing. I remember appreciating it, but feeling like I didn't get it. I felt it didn't give me a way in. So with this, he's kind of being like, okay, well, I'm going to create my own way into this universe and kind of use it as my playground. So I can see why real, like, hardcore Star Trek fans would feel that kind of animosity about that.
I never liked Star Trek when I was a kid. Growing up, I always thought it was, honestly, I couldn't get into it. My friends loved it, and I would, like, try, and I'd watch episodes, but it always felt too philosophical for me. And we tried to, like, some of the writers love Star Trek. I was not really a fan. My producing partner never saw it. Right. So when we were all happy, it felt like that was the way to go. And this movie that we did, the goal was to make a movie for moviegoers, not just for Star Trek fans. Right. So if you've never seen Star Trek before, you can see this movie. If you have seen it,
I mean, the interesting thing to me was I stopped listening to you when you said you didn't like Star Trek.
I wonder if it's a little bit similar to Michael Bay and Transformers, and I'm speaking from a little bit of ignorance because I'm not a Transformers fan, not a fan of the cartoon, not a fan of the film, so I don't quite know if it's a similar comparison. But the idea of a director with a very sort of clear idea of what he wants a film to be, like all his films feel somewhat similar, JJ Abrams. He's got a clear idea of what he wants a film to be, and then he's taking another product and kind of just layering his own cinematic ideology over that.
And I think also it's tainted by the fact that he was more of a Star Wars fan.
Yeah.
Which is now surprising, seeing as we talked about the Disney trilogy and all of the issues we had with that. But it feels like, again, with Star Wars, it was a case of everybody has their own idea of what Star Wars is like. I think everyone has their idea of what Star Trek is like, but it didn't help JJ Abrams' case that he didn't really know it as much as a lot of people and a lot of fans did previously. So he's already on the back foot with that. But I think he's made something a little bit more accessible for people just coming to Star Trek, though. And he's done it in a way that kind of creates this loophole. We've called it like a soft reboot.
Yeah.
But it's also connecting itself to the wider universe, isn't it? It's quite clever with that writing that they put in there. So it's a new Star Trek, and it's connected to your old Star Trek, but it's something a little bit different.
Yeah, it is a reboot. It's an alternate timeline explicitly. I mean, you literally have characters working that out and then saying out loud an alternate reality, just like to make it really obvious what we're talking about. But yeah, you have that, and it's existing in an alternate reality because of some time travel shenanigans. But they also bring back Leonard Nimoy playing the same character that he's been playing for 50 years at this point as the original older Spock, which makes this direct link, so that there is this kind of like direct connection. And it's a little bit more complicated than that because it takes place after Enterprise and after Discovery as well. So in theory, it's kind of like coherent. It should be coherent with those two things because everything that happens in this film happens after Enterprise and it was made after Enterprise. So, but I don't think that quite holds water, but that's how it should function within the Star Trek universe, isn't it?
But by saying it's an alternate timeline, you can kind of get away with a bit more and be like, right, it's a retelling of this.
Well, no, because it's an alternate timeline that diverges and becomes alternate after the events of Jonathan Archer on Enterprise and all of that. That happens before Kirk's era. So Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto's characters exist in a world. I mean, they even mention Admiral Archer's Beagle. That's Scott Bakula. So this is supposed to be consistent and doesn't undo or rewrite anything that happened in the series Enterprise.
That's so convoluted.
But obviously that doesn't, none of that quite works. We've got different actors, Nero recognizes Kirk and he's like, I know your face. And it's like, well, no, you don't, because we all know what Kirk's face looks like in your reality. It's William Shatner. Some of that stuff, there's a bit of friction there. Again, it's having your cake. It's this whole thing about having your cake and eating it too. It's like, well, we want it to be consistent with the Star Trek franchise, but we also have a whole new cast and we're doing a whole new style of filmmaking, and it's an alternate reality.
And they've also added all the sort of extra backstory elements, haven't they? How much of the backstories that you see in this film track with the original characters, do you think?
I mean, I can't remember enough about the characters talking about their kind of backstories in the original stuff. I think that like a lot of Spock's stuff is consistent. I don't remember him ever talking about his mum, but he's obviously half human. And then in theory, it should only really be Kirk that has a dramatically different backstory because of the main characters only, and maybe Pike because he was on the Kelvin. Those are the only characters whose lives were sort of significantly impacted by Nero, who arrives and then just seems to spend 25 years just chilling out.
So to clarify, Nero's the big bad in this, who is come from this alternate timeline. Well, he's come from the normal timeline in the future. So there's lots of timey-wimey stuff going on with this film. But it's basically, it's all there to serve the purpose for JJ Abrams being able to tell Star Trek from scratch again in a way which means that he can do what he wants with it without having to stick to all of the fundamentals in that original series. So he's able to go back to basics and really tell Kirk's story from being a child to being the captain of the Enterprise. But it's all sort of the development of his character and seeing him as a young, inexperienced captain as well is quite a nice added extra to this, because you are really seeing his character from the ground up.
I guess so. I mean, it's one of the things I found a little bit frustrating about this film. I have to say I still really love this film and it still kind of like ticks all the same boxes it always did. But I've watched this film many, many times, but I guess I haven't seen it in quite a while. And I was starting to see it maybe with the eyes of older fans back when it came out. And some of those things are quite frustrating. I mean, just the idea that he's captain of the Enterprise. He's a fucking cadet at the start of the film, and he is captain of not just a starship, but the flagship starship of Starfleet. I was a bit like, I mean, sure, they should give him a medal after the events of the film, but maybe it's like, and you get command of like a small starship. Now you can really prove yourself. I don't know. I just thought that was a bit mad. Everyone's just getting like promoted insanely fast. They're all cadets, and they're just running the bridge of the flagship vessel by the end of the film. It's crazy.
But it's what you want at the end of it. You want that payoff. But then it probably would have been more sensible to build up to that. And you know it's going to be a trilogy by this point, don't you? Because it's now the set formula for any sci-fi space opera-y kind of film has to be in a trilogy now. So you know it's going to try and get to that point. So you almost want to see Kirk get to that point.
Yeah. And well, it doesn't even, I didn't feel like it was going to be a trilogy. I was hoping for like a series of films, not, I was just used to so many Star Trek movies, I guess, that I wasn't like, okay, this needs to be a story told over 3 parts. Hopefully we'll get many films with this new cast, but yeah, it wasn't to be, or hasn't been yet. But I don't think this is coming back, is it?
Well, it feels like they've kind of axed it for the time being. I mean, there was talk of like Quentin Tarantino doing his own Star Trek film. All of this crazy stuff was rumored, but we did kind of get 3 outings with JJ Abrams' cast, and they went on lots of adventures. The second film went along some different tangents and brought back old villains. They had Khan, but they turned him into a real superhuman, which I know a lot of people had qualms with.
Had Khans with.
Terrible joke, Matt. Terrible. But it is praised as being this big action sci-fi, though, this film. And it came out in the wake of those Star Wars prequels, which you talked about previously. So audiences had kind of lost that kind of love of science fiction, because I think a lot of people were, I don't know, there's a lot of conflict with audiences at this point because they've just seen Star Wars become something that they didn't expect and didn't, like, old fans didn't love it. And then suddenly, here we go with Star Trek. Are they going to do the same thing again? And instead, JJ Abrams goes the opposite direction and makes it really action orientated, really sort of back to basics. And I think that's why it succeeds, because it's a fast-paced film. It's exciting. All of those kind of elements, they don't always stick in my head, if I'm honest, when I think of Star Trek. I think of Star Trek as more of a cerebral kind of series where there's lots going on and they're going and exploring new places. But I don't always see it as this full-on action that you get in this film.
Yeah, me neither. And maybe that's why I've felt a little bit differently watching the film. The thing is, the sort of the tension of it in my mind is that I think that this is an excellent action sci-fi movie, and I guess I'm mature enough to separate that from my wider feelings about the Star Trek franchise. So I can just continue to enjoy it as a sort of action sci-fi interpretation of the series that I love. But yeah, it's not what Star Trek does best. The best of Star Trek is, a character that you know fairly well having a sort of intense moral dilemma because of an interaction that they had with a computer, like something like that. That's a formula that is what you want. You want it to be about 45 to 50 minutes long, and everything pretty much goes back to the way it was. And someone's going to wrap it up pretty nicely with a little captain's log explaining what happened and why it was meaningful. That's Star Trek at its best. I've just made it sound dreadful, but like, if it can like make you think, stimulate your mind a little bit, that's when it's really magic. And this is just the completely opposite end of that kind of spectrum, isn't it?
Because you're right, because the series is kind of like sci-fi short stories.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of sci-fi each time. You're following the crew of whatever ship you're on throughout the series. And it can go to a different place and do a different thing every time. But when you're doing a Star Trek film, in this case, they've gone for the big spectacle, which puts it more in the realms of that space opera element, because it is... Yes. Massive set pieces, people flying through the sky, literally in coloured spacesuits whacking out massive katanas and swords and stuff, and then having big old fights.
And that is a more cinematic language, isn't it? Like you just mentioned that Star Trek is like short stories, and I think the best of Star Trek and most of Star Trek on TV could be written down and be, for the most part, as enjoyable if it was well written. But can you imagine sitting down with a novelization of JJ Abrams' Star Trek? It'd be awful, wouldn't it? I mean, there's very little plot. And the most powerful moments are because of things that really can only be communicated with the combination of acting, music, special effects, and everything else, sound effects. That it's a purely cinematic experience.
And it's interesting that JJ Abrams did that first Star Wars film after he'd done this, because he's doing the same kind of formula, isn't he? He's drawing on people's nostalgia. And there are moments when you're meeting other characters and it's that like, oh, you know who this is kind of moment. Like when you meet McCoy for the first time and they make that joke about his ex-wife taking everything but his bones. And then
that's awful.
Bones is meant.
Awful.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, so that's why he's called Bones.
But he's a doctor. That's why he's called. But it already made sense. It absolutely terrible. Probably the worst line in the film, I think.
Oh, it is funny, all of that kind of stuff. Do you think it feels camp like a traditional space opera, and like that original series had that feeling of campness around it?
I think that this film touches on camp and starts to get to camp, but disappointingly doesn't quite make it because it is based on Star Trek the original series, which was very camp and really understood camp. William Shatner completely understood the assignment with just how silly and camp to be as Kirk, literally like gurning and smirking and winking, all of this, but understanding, I think Shatner really does understand how silly he is, or he certainly did in the 1960s. I don't know if he's sort of disappeared up into his own ego later on, but he really understood that. And Spock as the straightest straight man that's ever been on film, and George Takei, who just, any excuse for Sulu to go completely bonkers and get in a sword fight or whatever. They all just understood that and really embraced it. And I think that this film is like getting there, but not quite. There's some stuff with like the Dutch angles, it starts to feel silly, and then I'm unsure if it's actually taking itself really seriously. It's like you're sort of on that line of really stepping into some fun camp stuff. There's really silly stuff, like when Kirk's hands get all swollen up, and there's humour, but I don't think that humour is camp in this film.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? And the way that Abrams is playing around with the sort of like the colour in the film, because all the Star Trek uniforms are very colourful, which again is kind of a throwback to all those space operas and all that kind of stuff, where it's part of the look of it, the Flash Gordon-esque 80s look of it. But then also these alien creatures that pop up. Prime example being the weird creature that is around with Scotty, when you meet Scotty all of a sudden just on this weird ice planet that he just stumbles upon.
Yeah, played by Deep Roy.
So yeah, it feels like it's got all of those kind of exotic space opera alien moments, because there is also, again, that ice planet that Kirk ends up on. There's that alien monster that's chasing him. So it's going, but that's not something that is Star Wars alone. This is something that has been part of Star Trek in the original series. Kirk will go to a planet and fight some sort of monster. Back in the day, it was hand-to-hand gladiatorial stuff. Now, in this kind of reinvention of it, it's the giant monsters chasing him as he's running along the snow.
It feels more like something out of Star Wars, I think. Definitely the Rancor or the big worm that they fly into in Empire Strikes Back, or I can't remember what it is. The one that's on the meteorite that they get stuck inside. That sort of feels more Star Warsy, but you can't say it's not Star Trek either. Like alien monsters is absolutely a Star Trek thing as well. It's just it feels like something that would happen in Star Wars more. Just to have like a big action run away from the monster sequence is not really something that happens in Star Trek.
And also the fact that they've made Kirk into a farm boy almost.
Yeah.
I think they make references to him being corn-fed and all this kind of stuff. So he's this small-town farm boy who happens to have this big lineage. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So they've got all of that kind of element in it, and he's going to be a savior of the Federation. So it's kind of going down that more space opera protagonist route. And there's an evil planet destroying element in there as well, which again is very sort of space opera. That's the big threat. So it's got those bits in it which feel very, very much like space opera tropes. Was there anything else that you saw which you were like, that's a space opera element that they've thrown in here?
Yeah, I think that the planet destroying ship stood out to me just because we've watched 2 other JJ Abrams reboot space opera movies recently, both of which feature planet destroying spaceships. So it's obviously something that stuck in his mind in 1977 and was a formative experience for him because he seems to introduce that. I think one of the other things that I sort of felt like this feels a bit more like space opera is the red matter. It feels like space opera. It also feels like JJ Abrams. Have you seen Mission Impossible 3?
Yes.
Which basically has no plot line at all. There is no story really. It's just he's just got to like save his girl and defeat Philip Seymour Hoffman, and it's pure action throughout. And that's an Abrams film. I think also written by the same guys as well with Abrams. It's them working together before they get together for this. You know, using that kind of like MacGuffin to drive the plot. I think they have something similar that they're trying to get in Mission Impossible 3. And in this, it's just called red matter. And there was 2 moments in the film where they refer to it. I think Nero refers to it first. He's just like, get the red matter. And I was watching it for this thinking, all right, I'm sure we'll be explained what red matter is later. Don't need to worry about that. And then the next time it's mentioned is in the mind meld where, or it might not be the mind meld, but when Spock is sort of doing the info dump and explaining what happened in the future, he's like, I was rushing to Romulus to save Romulus, and then I got the red matter out and I was going to use it to save Romulus. And again, I was thinking like, okay, well we've got Spock explaining it and he's just referring to it as the red matter, and nobody's explained what it is, and it's just a big ball of red that can create black holes. It's not going to satisfy the Star Trek fans who want a scientific explanation for stuff. It's barely satisfying the Star Trek fans who are happy with like a little burst of technobabble, because they're literally just saying the red matter. Like, what does it mean? And I was just like, it's fine. You know, it's a space opera. Like there's a MacGuffin that has unlimited power of some degree that drives the story. And in this case, it can create black holes and destroy planets. It's all you need to know. It's the Death Star.
Get out of jail free card, isn't it? It's like this will save the day if we throw this in.
This will save the day or destroy everyone, or if used correctly, do both.
Yeah, the ultimate. It's what you kind of need in a space opera. Something like that, which will just make everything go right again at the end of it.
It's also JJ Abrams. Is it JJ Abrams that talks about the mystery box in writing? Does the red matter sort of fit his approach to the mystery box? It's just a thing. It does what you need. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's his approach to these kind of things. That it's just more noticeable in this because Star Trek is so much about the technobabble a lot of the time, and having interactive games that you can play as a kid and go around all of the ships.
I never read about the red matter.
It's on an expansion pack. But we should talk about the cast of this as well, and all of the different actors that are taking up the mantle of these classic roles. What are your thoughts about some of the actors making up the crew of the Enterprise?
I think the whole thing is amazingly well cast. I don't really like Simon Pegg very much in this. I just find his accent a bit cringy. But I guess Scotty's accent was always a bit cringy, wasn't it? So maybe that's appropriate. But Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto are amazing. I really like Chris Pine. I sort of feel like he should have been in the MCU, right?
Yeah, he feels like he could have really fit one of those roles. What did you described him on our Patreon episode.
We did Don't Worry, Darling.
Yeah. What did you say about Chris Pine, Matt?
Well, I think I said that he has a rubbery face, but to contextualize that, I didn't want it to sound like an insult. I think he's very handsome, but he does have a bit of a rubbery face. Right?
It just makes you crack up every time you say it.
He has a rubbery face in a way that I think only exists in American men, you know? Like he has an American kind of handsomeness.
Wow.
That's
It's
the
too
only
good to
way
be true kind of look.
Yes,
Yeah.
like a sort of cartoonish handsomeness. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Good save.
But I think he is also quite aware of it as an actor, quite similar to Chris Hemsworth as well. It's interesting that Chris Hemsworth shows up as his father, someone who is self-consciously aware of how handsome he is and can kind of use that as a performer. I think both of those guys are very good at that. They're both, stunningly handsome men, but they sort of can use their own handsomeness as an acting tool in a very professional way that I really like about both of them. So he's perfectly cast as Kirk. To do all of that, I mean, he never really gets to do the sort of romancing alien girls. He does it a bit at the Academy, but I think that there's lots of like potential for him to do that as Kirk and make it be fun and playful and not gross, I guess, is important.
Yeah, I mean, he is eyeing up every single girl that he walks past, and they make quite a big thing out of that, don't they?
Yeah, but then most of them aren't bothered by him in this interpretation of him. Whereas I think Shatner would they'd all be swooning, Uhura and all of them.
And then we've got Carl Urban as McCoy, and there's a really funny meme that I've seen recently which says fantasy is when Carl Urban has long hair, and sci-fi is when Carl Urban has short hair. And if you look through his credentials, it's always the same. Like it's just one of the funny things about Carl Urban's performances. He always seems to have short hair in sci-fi and then long hair in fantasy. But I mean, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main distinguishing factors of those two genres, whether it's Carl Urban or not, right?
Exactly. Long hair or short.
I'd actually say, I think he's another actor who feels like he should have been in the MCU as well. And I think the reason I say that about these two guys is that they're both... Oh, wait, is he in it? You're making a face.
He was in Thor Ragnarok, which we covered a few episodes ago.
Oh, is he... Yes, he's quite good in that, isn't he? He's the one that sides with Hera.
Yep, and he has no hair, but a beard.
Short hair. Now, is that fantasy or is that sci-fi, James?
It's both, because he's got a bit
They've just cut his hair off.
There we go.
Sort of figure it all out. But he doesn't have, I don't know, he doesn't have quite as big of a role as he should. And the reason I say that about these guys is that they're both talented actors who are the right age to have played a superhero in the MCU in its pomp, and they're both handsome as well, which is obviously a requirement of being like a superhero in the MCU. So I don't know, they both feel like they should have been bigger, but I guess they've both done incredibly well career-wise, haven't they?
Yeah, exactly. And you also mentioned Zachary Quinto, who's playing Spock. He's great in this. He is like made to play Spock. I've only really seen him in Heroes other than this.
Yeah, me
American
too.
Horror Story.
I haven't seen that, but yeah, this does feel like perfect casting. He's really stepped into Leonard Nimoy's existence and kind of, but also carved out a kind of, they have carved out a place for Zachary Quinto's Spock by having the older Spock in this, because there is a distinct difference. Like older Spock is surprisingly playful. He's older. He's a bit world weary, but he's got a little bit of more humor than young Spock. He's lived a full life, whereas young Spock is this early in my career, must be serious, must have a good impression, not fully in control of my emotions. They carve out a nice little spot for him to exist as his own character, but at the same time, perfectly channeling Nimoy's performance.
Yeah, which is a great combination, but it's a very hard thing to pull off. And then, of course, you've got like an abundance of other great characters in this. You've got Zoe Saldana playing Uhura.
She was having a good year, wasn't she?
Yeah, I mean, doing all of the films. Yeah, she is. She's like box office material every time she's in something. But she was great. I think the way that she's fleshed out Uhura's character in this, and the sort of relationship that she has with Spock came a bit out of, because that's how the original kiss was supposed to have been written in the original series, right? That Spock was supposed to have kissed Uhura.
Was it? And then what, did Shatner kick off? Or
Yeah, and then Shatner was like, no, I want to do it.
Yeah.
Because it was the first interracial kiss on TV that was broadcast.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't know that it was originally written to be with Spock.
Yeah, I believe so. I think that was the case. And then also we've got Anton Yelkin, who sadly passed away, who played Chekhov. Great performance. John Cho playing Sulu. And he's great as Sulu. I really enjoyed him as Sulu. I still can't quite get over him as I always see him as a comedy actor now. But it was good seeing him in that role.
Yeah, I wish we could have had a moment where he goes a bit more insane. I'm glad that he got a sword fighting scene. That felt important for Sulu. And speaking of him getting a sword fighting scene, I quite like that all of the cast kind of get the shit kicked out of them. Like, that's something that certainly nowadays there's lots of like big action stars who don't do that in their films. Like, they like contractually don't get their asses handed to them. It's something that I always like about Tom Cruise. Like, his characters do get beaten up quite a lot. And yeah, like Chris Pine like gets beaten up like 6 times in the movie, and he kind of always comes back swinging, you know. And John Cho's kind of got some bruises and stuff on him after that fight. Yeah, I don't know. There's just something quite satisfying about that in an action movie. I think that we don't always see as much as we should nowadays.
And we've also got Eric Bana as our big bad in this,
amazing.
playing Nero. Yeah, he doesn't really do much.
No.
But he's just very scary. And that's kind of all you need in any sort of big action space opera sci-fi, right?
Yeah. I think that what you just described is epitomized by Spock steals old Spock's ship towards the end and uses it to destroy the drill that's attacking Earth, and one of his lackeys like radios him and is like, the drill's been destroyed, Spock's escaped with the ship, and he just stands up and goes, Spock! It's just like, you ain't doing it. He's not on board. Like, I don't know what you're trying to achieve. Just yelling, and that is essentially what Nero does for the whole film, isn't it? He just yells and occasionally deploys a drill.
The key to any big villain, just those two things, yelling and then some sort of weapon or drill.
Yeah, but Banner sells it. He's very good.
Captain Nero, the Vulcan ship has been taken. The drill has been destroyed. Spock!
Yeah, Banner's great in this. The whole cast is really great. It's a very fast-paced action film, and to me, it feels like space opera. It's got excitement. They visit different worlds. There is a hero fairer than whatever Brian Aldiss said in his space opera checklist.
Yeah.
There's all of this stuff going on, and I think it was an interesting example of JJ Abrams doing something that he may not have been comfortable with, but trying something a bit different with Star Trek, and maybe not doing what you would have expected from this kind of film, because there were an abundance of Star Trek movies which all felt very different prior to this, but this one went all out action, all out comedy and flamboyance in there, and it just offered up something different.
Yeah, and we've talked extensively about it being JJ Abrams bringing that different tone to it, but of course there are other people involved in this. It was written by Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, who are long-term collaborators of Abrams, but this was also the point in the Star Trek franchise where Kurtzman gets a foot in the door, and he is a very, very important figure in the modern history of Star Trek, and he uses that foot in the door to co-create with Brian Fuller his first Star Trek TV series, Star Trek Discovery, in 2017. So shall we move on and talk about that show and the 4 episodes that we've watched for today?
Sounds good to me.
Warp factor, I don't know, spore drive maximum.
Hey there, listeners. Have you ever wanted more than just our regular podcast episodes? Well, you're in luck.
Yes! All right!
That's right. If you're enjoying the show and want to support what we do, you can sign up to our Patreon by going to patreon.com/journey through sci-fi and get access to our regular bonus episodes.
We've got the Bad Movie Bunker over there, where we dive deep into the best of the worst and the worst of the worst in sci-fi cinema.
Bad Movie Bunker.
And if you've ever wanted to have a say on what we review, check out our Patrons Picks, where our patrons get to choose their favourite undiscovered sci-fi gems for us to dissect and discuss.
Patrons Pick. But that's not all, folks. We're always keeping our feed up to date with the latest in science fiction cinema. You'll get the freshest reviews, along with exclusive miniseries covering the biggest and best sci-fi franchises.
So if you're ready for an even deeper dive into our sci-fi universe, become a patron today and unlock exclusive bonus episodes that you won't find anywhere else.
We hope to see you there, but for now, let's get back to the episode.
This is not our universe.
So far, we can conclude that we are indeed in a parallel universe, but one not governed by the Federation, but by a fascistic human-only organization known as the Terran Empire.
Long live Captain Burnham! Long live the Empire!
Long live the Empire.
What's a spool drive?
Oh, James.
It's too much to say. We're gonna eat into the episode.
It's important. It's important. It is important in terms of the tone and the style of Star Trek Discovery, because the spore drive is what makes the ship Discovery special in Star Trek Discovery. Yes. It doesn't have a warp drive, it has a spore drive, which runs on the mycelial network, which is like space fungus that is everywhere, I think. And the spore drive somehow taps into this mycelial network to, I think, basically travel anywhere it wants. There must be limitations, but essentially travel anywhere it wants in the known universe, like in an instant. I think it's something like that. And that's what makes the Discovery such a sort of special, weapon in the war that they're fighting in this series. The reason I say it's important is just that Discovery is a pretty mad, crazy show. And it's stuff like that is why it's so mad and weird. And I think that's important to understand in a discussion about Discovery.
But even having that explanation of the science, the pseudoscience behind that.
Yeah, it's a fungus drive, yeah.
Yeah, but that makes it seem more in the realms of Star Trek that we all know.
Oh, I don't know,
rather than
mate.
Red matter.
Well, okay. I don't know. I think that this was one of the problems that I had with Discovery when it started, was that I just couldn't accept concepts like a mushroom engine.
A mushroom engine. Sounds great. Oh, think of the money you'd save.
Well, yeah, but you need a mycelial network to tap into, which I've never encountered.
As of yet. But we have encountered it in this show. So Star Trek Discovery was a series that I didn't watch. I was not familiar with what was happening with there. I remember all of the hype around it, though. Because again, there'd been a bit of a lull in Star Trek television series, from what I understand. Around comes the 50th anniversary of the original series in 2016. So then this series gets announced shortly afterwards. So again, what was the gap like between this and the last Star Trek series?
Yeah, so Star Trek, as I said, Star Trek had been consistently coming out for 18 years without a break, between 1987 and 2005, Next Generation through to the end of Enterprise. And then you have some films, you have some Chris Pine, Zachary Quinto movies in the interim, but on television, there's no new Star Trek for another 12 years, so 2005 through to 2017. So again, speaking about it sort of subjectively, we're talking my entire life up till 2005, and then almost the same time again in my life with no Star Trek on TV. So again, it felt like a really, really long time with no Star Trek. So when Discovery was coming out, I remember being, again, like the JJ Abrams film, really, really excited, because it was new Star Trek, new weekly Star Trek in the same universe, consistent with everything I know, carrying on. I was a little bit annoyed that it was another prequel, because all I really want for Star Trek is for it to just keep going with the next generation timeline through to Voyager. I just want to keep going into the future and see what happens. And I've always been disappointed that they just keep going back to the beginning and beyond the beginning. But I was excited. And I wanted to like it. And it was good first episode. And then it just became increasingly kind of crazy and weird.
Yeah.
And I found it really hard to keep up with. I think I watched 2 seasons of it, and sort of a minor spoiler, but I don't even think it's a big deal. I think at the end of season 2, or it might be the end of season 3, they just go like 600 years into the future. And then the rest of the show takes place there.
That sounds like what happened with the Battlestar Galactica original series.
Yeah, with Galactica 1980.
Yeah, interesting.
And that's when I gave up on Discovery, because I was a bit like, I wasn't really enjoying it, and I was like, it feels like the people who make this show have just sort of given up on their premise and are trying to completely change the show halfway through. And I was like, I think I can drop off here.
But what was the initial premise? So the initial premise is that it's set before the original series. So again, we're going right back to basics.
Yeah, but after Enterprise.
So
it's about 10 to 20 years before Kirk's time. The main character is the adoptive daughter or foster daughter of Sarek. So she is the adoptive sister of Spock. Spock shows up later. He's not. He's probably in season 1, or he's definitely in season 2, and it's set during the war with the Klingons. The Discovery is sort of gonna turn the tide of the war because it's such an amazing ship. Now, it's very important to then set out that none of that information is important, because Discovery sort of goes off on like 15 different insane tangents, one of them being having 4 episodes in the middle of season 1 set in the Mirror Universe that have absolutely nothing to do with that war that's been the main serialized plot of the show. And the captain turns out to not be the captain, so he is killed off in these episodes that we watch. He's like one of the main characters of the show. It's really interesting and weird stuff. I think this all comes from Brian Fuller. Have you watched many other shows by Brian Fuller?
Yeah, I'm familiar with quite a lot of the stuff that he's worked on. I mean, he's done, because he wrote on Heroes, Pushing Daisies, all of these different kinds of shows. Obviously, Voyager and Deep Space Nine, he's down as one of the credits for. And what he went on to do later, American Gods.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a big Neil Gaiman fan, so I was very excited when that came out. Less excited after I'd watched a few episodes.
Oh, really?
But it was, I was very excited to see that. So he's done a lot, hasn't he?
Yeah, he also did Hannibal as well. You've watched that, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. Forgot about Hannibal, geez.
That's what I associate with Brian Fuller, because Hannibal is a kind of, what feels like a very familiar story that, we've seen the movies and we read the books and stuff. And then his interpretation of it is just like, nothing's off limits. I can just go as weird as I want to and go really crazy with the storylines within a kind of framework that has to fit the original plot lines. I think he has this like writing rule of like, work out your overall story arc, decide where you want it to end, and then do that thing in like episode 4, and then just figure out what to do after it. Just like turn the whole thing on its head and go absolutely crazy with it. I think that's his like writing ethos. I don't know if I'm just making that up, but that is certainly
that's how it feels.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly what happens in Discovery. It's just have a premise and then completely diverge from that. And I also don't know if that is his influence, because I know he left Discovery like quite early in season 1, but I do think it was his kind of, he plotted out season 1, and I think other people picked it up and like continued his plans.
But like you said earlier, it feels very different to a lot of the other Star Trek.
Yeah.
It's the fact it's set during a war as well, a war with the Klingons. That's quite important, because that's basically every space opera we've seen. There's been some sort of war and rebel factions, and I think that's quite a key thing that's going on in this. But even more specifically, in this story arc which we're talking about today, it's set in a place where there's not just a war, there is an evil empire, and there are people rebelling against this evil empire. So it's very much good versus evil, which is just a classic space opera trope that we've seen again and again. It's very clear the division in that. And that's all from this mirror universe, isn't it? And for people which might not know, what is the mirror universe in Star Trek?
The mirror universe is a alternate world, parallel dimension that first showed up in the original series. So there is a very old trope, that even people who aren't familiar with Star Trek may be aware of, which is that if a character's doppelganger shows up in a TV show and they've got a goatee, that means they're an evil version of the character that we know and love. That is a very overused trope nowadays, to the point where it's become like a joke, like the Wilhelm scream. But it comes from Star Trek. It comes from the original series, where Spock is evil in the mirror universe, and he has a goatee, and that's how you know he's evil Spock. He's evil because basically everybody in the mirror universe is an evil version of everybody we know. It's like the Terran Empire, which I don't think is named that. I can't remember. I don't think the name is I think that was decided later, but the characters find themselves in the mirror universe probably because of it. I think transporter malfunction, or whatever. It's always something like that. Transporter goes wrong and Kirk beams onto the wrong Enterprise and replaces the evil Kirk, who is the captain of that ship, working for an evil version of the Federation, the Terran Empire. And yeah, everyone's just a bad guy over there. All series of Star Trek have mirror universe episodes, I think. Certainly most of them do. But this is a 4-parter in Discovery. This is definitely the longest we've spent in the mirror universe in one time. And they really get into the politics of the mirror universe and the empire that is running the show.
Yeah, I really loved all that about this little story arc as well, because I remember covering that original series episode that you just mentioned when we were looking at Dystopia. So we were talking about, yes, we went into detail about what happened in that episode in the mirror universe. So revisiting it for today's podcast was quite an interesting experience for me, because again, I've never seen Discovery. This was my entry point into Discovery, just jumping into these episodes. It didn't feel too bewildering though, because you kind of understand what the crew's like, because they're all quite Star Trek staples. And you kind of can latch on to what's happening. And it also felt a bit different because you're in the mirror universe. It's a separate kind of story. You're going to meet different versions of the characters. It just kind of worked for me. But it is always striking when you see the evil versions of them and this Terran Empire and just how they function and the difference that they have to the Federation. And I think one of the things which really stuck out for me is they're so evil that they eat other aliens. There was a moment in this where that happens, and that really took me aback, because I felt like that wasn't something you would see in most Star Trek iterations, really.
Yeah, they're the antithesis of the Federation. I mean, the whole point of the Federation is that it just exists to make peace with other alien races and convince those other alien races to join them and become a bigger federation of planets, and all work together for the betterment of that widening society. The Terran Empire is the exact opposite. It's fiercely xenophobic and, just hates all other races and just seeks the sort of expansion and control of a human-only empire to the destruction of all other races if necessary. So yeah, willing to keep slaves, willing to eat those slaves, as a delicacy with no sort of care for them. They're so evil that Klingons, the mortal enemies of the Federation at this time in Starfleet's history, have banded together with Vulcans and everyone else to basically make the Federation, in resistance and in rebellion against this evil empire.
That's such a space opera thing as well, isn't it? The rebellion against the evil empire. And this evil empire is stylized as that kind of almost stormtrooper-esque uniform that they have. It's all black. They're almost dressed in sort of bondage, all of this kind of stuff that adds to it. And there's an empress as well. So you've got like a evil empress ruling over it. It's kind of that feudal system again that you've got. And she lives in a palace. All of this stuff is very much like what we've seen again and again throughout this series.
Yeah. And I think like Discovery actually plays with some space opera stuff in how wacky it is and how crazy it is. But the Mirror Universe really is that playground for really delving into those tropes, especially in Michelle Yeoh's character. It's good to see her back. So she's in like the pilot episode of Star Trek, as you will have. So she's in like the pilot episode of Discovery, as you will have inferred from the, Michael Burnham's reaction to her. She dies, and I certainly was not expecting her to come back. But they bring her back. I don't blame them. She's a obviously incredible actor, and with a plan to kill off Lorca, I think it was necessary to have a character like that coming into the frame. She's so you might be aware that they're doing other stuff with her. So to fill in the gaps, if you haven't watched Discovery, she comes back with them into the main universe, and she joins Section 31, who are I think we talked about Section 31 in the Dystopia series.
Yeah, we have mentioned them.
Yeah, they might not even be called Section 31 yet in Discovery. It's like really early days of this organization, and I think that they were trying to make a TV series for her. Which I think has morphed into a film now that's on its way. So she becomes a recurring character, and they bring her back into the fold.
And Section 31 was that kind of like the naughty Star Trek enforcers.
Yeah.
The feds.
Yeah, the division of either Starfleet or the Federation, I can't remember, that is willing to do the things that the rest of the Federation doesn't want to know is happening in their utopia, willing to bend the rules and do some pretty nasty stuff.
Well, she's perfect for that, because in this story arc, you see her and you see all of the other Terran Empire, and they are just really terrible people. They're violent, they're sweary, they're doing all just these horrendous sort of war crimes just throughout this story arc. And yeah, you can see why that kind of twists what people know and love about Star Trek, because you're seeing this kind of flip side of it. And I think that's kind of not what Star Trek is generally about.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the show in general had a lot more violence and swearing than audiences would have been familiar with. It was actually quite jarring to hear any swear words in a Star Trek series when Discovery came out. Even, before they went to the Mirror Universe, there's like a very small number of like casual uses of the word shit used in an almost comedic way, which I remember like the first time I saw it, I was like, that does not sound like Federation language. That was a really minor thing, I think, but I think a lot of people picked up on it of like, this just feels different. And it was one of the things that like really put me off the show, to be honest. But I guess I don't begrudge it, because Kurtzman has completely breathed life back into the Star Trek franchise. And even though I've dropped off as a viewer, I'm glad that Star Trek is sort of back on television regularly and seemingly going from strength to strength.
And there's moments in this where like we talked, like talking about the violence, it's not just from the Terran characters.
Yeah.
Michael Burnham, who is the sort of protagonist of this show, she later becomes captain. She's the one we're really following. And she's positioned as this character who has basically started this war with the Klingons inadvertently. She kills a character quite early on. I know it's kind of a life or death situation, but in one of these episodes, she full on kills a guy in a lift. Yeah. And I just wasn't expecting that to happen, because that doesn't seem like what you would do as a Star Trek officer. But then obviously it's a different kind of show, and it's a different experience that she's having to go through.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what would you do in Star Trek? I think you would just swing one punch and knock them out, I suppose. And then we don't talk about whether they lived or died, but we can assume they just knocked unconscious, taken to the brig, right? That's the kind of standard protocol from a storytelling perspective in Star Trek, I guess. But you can also just zap a bad guy with a phaser, can't you?
Yeah, exactly. But she didn't really have a phaser to hand in this. But this whole story arc as well is interesting because it's all about them trying to get back to their universe. At the same time, it becomes a story about them trying to help the rebels and try to save not just this universe, but every universe. So it has these really grand stakes, which again throw it into that realm of space opera, because there's again a planet destroying, universe destroying weapon of mass destruction that's there, and they're having to use pseudoscience to fix it and then cause some big explosion that will just make everything go okay again.
Yeah, and there's also moments in there that I really like. There's some stuff about taking Star Trek to a space opera, and then how do our characters interact with that. There's a moment where, you know, most of the characters just want to get the hell out of there. Let's figure out how to get out of here. But Michael sees an opportunity to actually like speak to this senior Klingon and actually try and really understand why he's able to work with other races and work together to find common ground and defeat and fight against the Terrans. And she sees that as an opportunity. Well, I can take this back in the name of peace and use it in our universe and try and crack the Klingons using their own logic somehow. That really felt like a pure like Star Trek moment, a real like Starfleet bit of behavior interacting with a space opera universe in a way that's like I can exist in this space opera universe, remain a Starfleet officer, and return to my universe with the experience. That I really loved that. That felt like pure original Star Trek, but interacting with this space opera vibe.
And they've got all of that, the element of kind of double cross in there as well, which again feels a bit like, it reminded me of, I think this whole story arc kind of reminded me of Titan AE a little bit, just in terms of there's a character who ends up sort of almost double crossing them, but unknowingly.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so it's Michael Burnham's love interest in this. Turns out that he has been like changed into, like he's had his personality overwritten with that of a Klingon and had his body changed so he's part Klingon. It's very
he is a Klingon.
He is a Klingon, but
he's had his body changed. Yeah, basically he's had whole body surgery to be sort of genetically identical, apparently, to a human.
Very like unneeded.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty mad stuff. I remember that also being something that I did a big eye roll when that was revealed. So I was just like, oh, this is crazy. Like,
it is crazy. And then they've got a doctor who's talking to the weird stuff that is making the what did you call it? The spore drive work.
So at this point in the story, I think for some contrived reason, he had to be like hooked up to the spore drive in order for it to work. But then every time they did a spore drive jump, it was really painful for him. So at this point in the story, he did like 100 like the episode before, so that they could do some stuff and defeat a Klingon ship. And that's completely knocked him out. And now he's like gone into a fungal coma where he's like speaking to the mycelial network in his mind. It's all just crazy. It's all just absolutely crazy. But it's fantasy tropes, right? You know, it is. This is where it becomes space fantasy,
and it's swashbuckly as well because of all the different. Again, that's not even the biggest double cross. The biggest double cross is when you find out, like you said earlier, the captain who you've been following throughout this series, who is the one who got our lead character out of prison. If you find out that his whole motive for all of this is because he's an evil doppelganger and he's trying to get back to his universe, and it's all just sprung on you really quickly.
Yes, yeah. Imagine watching this series week by week, James, for 10 weeks or more than 10 weeks, about 12 or 13 weeks, and then the captain of the ship is a bad guy and then dies.
But I had a vague recollection of something like this happening because there were loads of news reports, weren't there, when this happened?
Breaking news.
Breaking news. I mean, I feel like it would have been breaking news for me at least, given the kind of news that I look at online.
Peter Sissons came on at 6 p.m. and delivered this news.
But yeah, it's such a. I remember it being a big bit in pop culture. Like, what the hell's going on with Star Trek Discovery?
Yeah.
This early on, like, this is mental.
Yes, it was completely crazy and just a genuinely hard show to follow. I think it's one that I might be ready to revisit and just sort of go back into it. Because to be honest, I haven't followed the Kurtzman era of Star Trek because I just didn't like Discovery very much. But I don't know if like watching a load of space opera has steeled me against some of the wackier elements of Discovery, and I might be in a better headspace to watch this again and just go along with the crazy ride. And I think it's the Fuller influence. I think it's Brian Fuller's storytelling that makes this first season so completely off the wall and all over the place.
Do you think that this, in the same way that JJ Abrams was influenced by Star Wars, do you think that this version of Star Trek has been influenced by the influx of space opera that had happened prior to this being released? So all of the different space opera films that happened since the 70s, do you think that has had an impact on how people view Star Trek and what it could potentially be?
I think that Discovery was an attempt to bring it back a bit more, because it's not Abrams' Star Trek. It does have some quite big space battles, but like I was saying, some of like how Michael is, she really does feel like a more traditional Starfleet officer, and other characters have that as well. They have that sort of like nobility and seriousness and professionalism that I associate with Starfleet. But I think that there's something that has happened in the 12-year interim on television that they're trying to blend, something about like prestige TV and serialization and character-led drama rather than ideas-led stories. I think that Discovery was an attempt to blend those things together. And I think there's a dash of like action, space opera action that's thrown in. But I think that just might be more of the big budget end of it, and the spectacle that is allowed from a bigger budget, which in turn is allowed from, you know, the golden age of television having happened in between. So there's more money available for producing TV.
And it feels like they felt at this point that that's what people want to see. They want to see that big budget spectacle. Whereas if you go back to sort of 2009 and look at the other sort of big TV sci-fi stuff that was out there, if we think about Battlestar Galactica again, that's very much a story-led focus on what's actually happening to these characters, what they're going through. They've got a sort of clear direction for what's going to happen later on in the series, and it doesn't rely, obviously it's got big spectacle moments in it, but it doesn't rely on that all the time. I mean, I haven't seen enough of Discovery to really make a comment on that, but just watching this story arc, it feels like it's a lot more action focused. There's lots of fight scenes, there's lots of big space battles happening, and it feels more like along the lines of that 2009 Star Trek movie in that respect, but even more off the wall because you're just going off script and doing all this extra stuff. And I think that, again, it's more space opera-y with all of that stuff.
And I think there is more room for that on TV, because I think in 2009 we were still going to the cinema for the blockbuster stuff, and I think there is more of an expectation that TV should be able to deliver that now, because you know the money's just like floating around wherever, and special effects don't really have much of a boundary. I think you probably still get better special effects on a movie's budget, but TV is capable of doing the kind of blockbuster action that is needed to give a sensation of space opera. So I think that there is more of an expectation that it'll happen on TV. I think that's the shift that had happened between the Abrams film and Discovery starting.
I'm interested to see what new space opera TV shows come out in the future and whether they will work in the same way. I'm thinking about other big sci-fi TV series. We're going to be starting a mini series on The Expanse soon on our Patreon channel, and that's going to be an interesting one to look at because I know that's a really beloved series that has been one of the big sci-fi ones to sort of hit home with a lot of fans. So I'm interested to see what are going to be the ones subsequently that really sort of hit home for people.
Well, I think it's going to be, I mean, there's a lot more Star Wars TV shows that are still going to happen, aren't there? There has been talk of another reboot of Battlestar Galactica, but there's been talk of that for a very long time. I don't know if that'll ever come to fruition, but I do wonder if that series were rebooted, if the angle that they could take would be more like an action series, because there would be more capability, I think, to just focus on a lot more of an action-driven plot line instead of the kind of, religious, philosophical stuff that the 2003 series did.
But there's been lots of other Star Trek series since Discovery, haven't there? They seemed like Paramount seemed to be going all over the place with Star Trek at the moment.
Yeah, I dropped off the franchise. I do need to watch Picard, because Picard did that thing that I've been saying I wanted from Star Trek for such a long time, which is just
I was thinking
continue the plot. But I think I just kind of dropped off. I always, you know what I'm like, I get it in my head that in order to watch Picard, I need to watch the series. I need to continue Discovery and finish Discovery, even though I don't think it matters because Discovery is set way before Picard and then way after Picard. So, it's not going to matter. But, we're completists, aren't we?
Yeah, it's that one bit of information that you're like, yes, of course, I remember this from episode 153 that's now referenced in episode 512.
I didn't enjoy it properly, James, because I didn't watch all the episodes. Yeah, it's stupid. It's just absolutely stupid.
There's YouTube videos now where you can catch up on all of that kind of stuff if you need to.
So, yeah, I think I will pick up Picard, if nothing else. And Strange New Worlds looks really good as well. So that's something that they brought into Discovery. They brought Captain Pike and Number One and Spock, and the Enterprise shows up just before they zoom off hundreds of years into the future. And they were amazing. Like Anson Mount plays Pike, and he's perfect. It did kind of feel like, well, this is just like he's just kind of doing a Kirk thing, and it's just, but it did seem pretty good, to be fair. And yeah, I think Strange New Worlds could be pretty good. I suspect it will just be kind of a retread of the original series, but I'm up for that.
Yeah, well, that sounds like one I'd quite like to check out in the future. Who knows, it might end up on another Star Trek special in the future on this podcast as well.
Yeah, there's plenty more to go. That's also a nice feeling about having not kept up with Star Trek, is that I have watched so many hundreds of episodes of Star Trek in my life, and now there lies hundreds more episodes ahead of me that I haven't seen. And that's actually quite a nice feeling. It's like, have you ever seen a movie where a character, it actually shows up in Battlestar Galactica, where a character's not read the last chapter of this book because they love the book so much, which is obviously a bullshit trope because you'd be insane if you truly did that. But that's kind of where I'm at with Star Trek now. I never have to finish Star Trek. I quite like the idea that there's always more Star Trek that I haven't seen, and I can, if I never finish it, that's actually fine.
Yeah, you can always go back to the well for more.
And long may it rain. And if there's another 12-year period where there's no Star Trek, I hope it gets rebooted again in a completely weird and different way, and some other maniac, some other Hollywood maniac gets his hands on it and does something crazy with it. I hope that
80s Flash Gordon style Star Trek.
Exactly, yeah.
Which just goes super camp, super over the top. I could see it.
Yeah, long may it rain.
So I think that about wraps up our Star Trek special. I've really enjoyed this one because I know when we were trying to plan this one out, we weren't sure how we would position it in terms of space opera, but I think we've come to a good conclusion with this. In general, Star Trek's too big to pigeonhole into space opera, but there's always going to be elements.
Star Trek's everything. I hope we never do a series where Star Trek doesn't fit, because I truly believe it fits all sci-fi subgenres.
And on that note, we are almost at the end of this series, our space opera series. So next time we will be getting to our grand finale in our space opera series. It's our conclusion episode. It's the episode where we dish out a bunch of awards to the films we've covered and just have some fun revisiting some of the stuff.
Yeah, always a load of fun. We're going to be going over our favourites and handing out some awards for the best in our categories. But also let us know what we've missed this series. It's been a long series. We try to cover everything as we always do, but there is always stuff that we haven't covered. So let us know.
Yeah, let us know what your favourite space opera films are that we might not have covered, as Matt just said. And if there's any films you think deserve a special award for whatever category, if there's an award that you would dish out to any of these films, let us know and we will try and include it in the episode.
Yeah, so we will be handing out those awards and many more next time on the show. Join us for our final space opera episode.
I'll be wearing a tux.
I'll be wearing a Jedi robe.
That's more apt.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Journey Through Sci-Fi.
You can find us at journeythroughsci-fi.com, where you can find links to our social media and join the conversation.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard and want to support us, why not leave us a review on your podcast app of choice? It really helps new people find the show.
You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/journeythroughsci-fi, where you can receive exclusive bonus episodes every month.
Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and we'll see you again next time for another Journey Through Sci-Fi.